Part 2. Lots more car stories. I will start with one of the more dramatic Austin 16 incidents and return to Aldwyn Tower later. Episode 1. A wheel comes off and overtakes us. I was driving a second Austin 16 GW0496 to work at Smith's Aircraft Instruments, which was situated between Bishop's Cleeve and Cheltenham. I had 2 passengers. I went over a bridge on Stokes Road, and as I came down on the other side, the right-hand back wheel came off and we ground to a halt. The wheel overtook us and finished up in the hedge on the right-hand side of the road. My passengers flagged down an acquaintance, and I was left to decide what to do. I retrieved the wheel. The hub was still attached to it. I jacked up the car and examined the axle. The half shaft was broken where the taper joined the threaded part. A classic failure at a change of section. However, I was surprised to see that both faces of the brake were rusty. Obviously the hub had stayed in place for some time, simply by its tight fit on the taper. The outer part of the bearing was still in the hub, but the inner part was on the axle. The drive was achieved by a Woodruff key, which was still in place. The balls of the bearing were scattered on the road. An awful idea occurred to me. If I could find enough of the ball bearings, perhaps I could hold them in place with some grease and bang the hub back on the taper. Then, driven carefully, I might be able to reach the car park at Smith's. I searched the road and found about 3/4 of the balls. Some stiff grease held them in place. The next step was to undo the wheel nuts and offer up the brake housing and hub assembly to the axle, taking care to align it with the key. I then hit it hard with my fitting hammer, and happily it seemed to jam in place on the taper. I gave it a couple more hits for luck. It was really just the fit of the taper that was holding it. I put the wheel back on and gently lowered the car down. The wheel stayed in place. With very little confidence I got back in and set off. The right-hand turn on the A435 was the biggest risk, so I took it with a wide curve. Smith's was not more than a couple of miles away, and I succeeded in reaching the car park that you can see in the bottom right of this picture without incident. I was amazed that it had worked. At the end of the day we were able to catch a lift back to Malvern. On the Saturday, a friend and I found a replacement axle in a scrapyard, and on the Sunday fitted it to the injured Austin. We were triumphant. The whole exercise was almost unbelievable. Not long after, we swapped the Austin for a 1934 Lanchester. Operating this demanding vehicle and its problems are described later in this video. Lateral thinking was important. Once coming back from somewhere with 2 cars, one of them developed an engine fault that couldn't be fixed at the side of the road. A search showed us we hadn't got our tow rope, so we pushed the injured car bumper to bumper. We even overtook a car at one point. Car bumpers really were bumpers in those days. Episode 2. 2 cars, 1 set of number plates. Our friends are of great importance. We went on trips together, and at the drop of a hat they would come to the rescue when due to a breakdown we needed help. One of our best friends had the nickname Flash. I don't know how he acquired it, but he was game for anything and was great fun to be with. He had 2 Citroën Light 15s. Unlike this advert, they were black and almost identical. He operated them via 1 set of number plates, tax and insurance. Whichever car was in the best state received the honour. He was mentioned in Part 1, and you will hear more of him later. I'll return now to my time at the College of Electronics. Episode 3. Stuart leaves Aldwyn Tower. At the end of Term 4, Stuart moved out of Aldwyn Tower prior to marrying Pat in January 1964. Chris and I recruited a replacement to share the rent. He wasn't a good choice, and it led to trouble. Some weeks later we had a party, but our recruit told loads of people. It was a riot, and bottles were dropped out of the windows. The landlord evicted us, and I had to find another flat. The landlord was a friend of Rosalind's father, but luckily my name never came up. The next flat was in Priory Road and was nothing like as good. Episode 4. The Vauxhall Wyvern. Rosalind didn't like motorbikes, so sadly I sold the Venom Clubman. Without the Venom I needed transport and bought a second-hand car, a Vauxhall Wyvern. It had a steering column gear change. Sometimes the mechanism would get tangled, which required a stop and opening the bonnet to untangle it. There were only 3 forward gears, and it was not very fast, but we did a lot of miles in it. We took it down to Cornwall. However, when returning to Malvern, disaster struck. Unless it was for mechanical reasons, I rarely stopped on a journey, but Rosalind saw a cafe and wanted to pause for tea. We'd overshot it, so slightly irritated, I selected reverse gear and let in the clutch before the car had come to a complete stop. There was a bang, and we had broken a half shaft. Luckily it was close to some waste ground, so we pushed the Wyvern onto it. But what to do? We were too far away to ring a friend for a tow, and we had a lot of luggage. There was a house nearby, and the people there kindly let us put our luggage in their garage. The rest of the trip was completed by hitchhiking. My friend Colin Dovey lived in a cottage on Bringsty Common. He didn't have a phone, but I rang the pub that he visited, and we got in touch. On the next Saturday we went to Worcester Scrapyard, and luck was with us. They had a Wyvern. However, swapping the back axle was more difficult than for an Austin 16. The Wyvern had hydraulic brakes. I knew this, and during the week I'd made 4 special clamps. We used 2 of them to close the flexible hoses and remove the axle and hoses together. Sunday we set off early and swapped the axles using the other 2 clamps to minimise the hydraulic fluid loss till the last moment. We'd brought some more fluid, and bleeding the brakes went surprisingly well. We collected the luggage and thanked the garage owners. The return to base went without incident, and things went on as before. Episode 5. Swapping the Wyvern for the Wonky Wing Austin. Unfortunately, when the next MOT arrived, the Wyvern failed on kingpins and steering bushes. I didn't have anywhere to work on it, but Stuart had a place in Worcester, and the Austin with the Wonky Wing surprisingly had a long MOT, so we did a swap. Rosalind's mother wasn't too pleased. "You can't park that old gypsy car in front of our house," was her comment. So visiting Rosalind, I had to park some distance away and walk. With a lot of effort, Stuart repaired the Wyvern and sold it. Episode 6. The Front Axle Bodge. Rosalind and I, together with a friend Tony Brewer, had planned a weekend trip to North Wales in the Wonky Wing Austin. In preparation, we'd taken a Friday off. About lunchtime, we discovered a fault in one of the front wheel bearings. We'd heard on the grapevine that there was an Austin 16 in the Malvern scrapyard, so in the afternoon, with the bearing clicking, we went to see it. The donor car was in a good position, so we jacked it up and removed the front wheel. The workshop service diagram shows that to remove the hub, one should take out the split pin and unscrew the retaining nut. However, the next stage was to pull the hub off with a special extractor. We didn't have one. However, I did have a big lorry-type tyre lever. I slipped one end of the lever under the edge of the hub, and using one of the brake shoes as a pivot, hit the other end of the lever with a hammer. It didn't work. I had to go from the opposite side and repeated the process several times from each side, but no go. The scrapyard owner said on Fridays he packed up early, so we'd better get a move on. This was desperate. Then I noticed a piece of scaffolding pipe about 10 feet long. We slipped it over the end of the lever, and both of us pushed hard on the other end. There was a bang. Initially I thought that the lever had broken, but the hub was lying on the ground a couple of feet away. We bought the hub, the pipe, and the 2 brake shoes which had suffered somewhat. Returned to base, we repeated the extraction technique on our Austin, using the scrapyard brake shoes as the pivots. I replaced our brake shoes and fitted the donor hub. Thinking the job was almost over, I tightened the retaining nut. Disaster! The thread on the stub axle stripped. In annoyance, I hit the end of the axle with my fitting hammer. To my surprise, the shaft was quite malleable. I found I was able to work the end of the shaft over the nut. In fact, I was able to produce a respectable imitation of a rivet. There was little point in refitting the split pin. There was no way this hub was ever going to come off again. Episode 7. The Petrol Tank Near Disaster. Rosalind and I went to a party at a house down an unmade-up road. When the party broke up, several people wanted a lift. They piled into the back of the Austin and we set out. Unfortunately, due to the heavy load and the state of the road, a projection consisting of a block of cemented bricks tore the petrol tank drain completely out. A couple of gallons of petrol gushed on the road. "Get out! Get out!" I shouted. Luckily no one was smoking and there were no sparks. It could have been very different. The following day, a friend and I went back to examine the situation. As a start, we pushed the car to a suitable place to work on it. The threaded drain plug, its threaded boss, and a plate about 2.5 inches square had been torn off. The tank wasn't bent. The 4 rivets that held the plate in place and a searing of solder had given way. Holding it back in place, it fitted quite neatly. I decided to try securing it with araldite epoxy resin. The problem was how to hold it in place while the epoxy cured. The Austin 16 had a novel jacking system. There were 4 hydraulic posts that could be lowered by means of a hand pump. We'd used it before and it leaked too badly to be worth topping up with hydraulic fluid, but it worked okay with water. Not a long-term solution, but usable. I decided to jack up the back, araldite the tank and plate, and then gently lower the car down with a couple of bricks positioned to hold the assembly in place. A dry run enabled me to get the support to apply a suitable force. The fine tuning was done with some pieces of slate that were lying around. We completed the job and left it for a couple of days to cure. When we returned, everything looked okay. We put a gallon of petrol in and checked for leaks. Nothing happened, so we put in another gallon and drove home. The repair lasted the rest of the time we had the car. Episode 8. I lose my RRE security pass. RRE was involved in a lot of defence projects, and we all had to sign the Official Secrets Act. We were provided with photo security passes. Returning from one hitchhiking trip, I realised that I'd lost my pass. It was treated very seriously. I had to attend an investigation. I was faced by 3 officers in uniform. They didn't shine a light in my eyes, but they wanted to know where I might have lost it. I started to relate a long list of lifts. They asked me where I was going, but when I replied nowhere in particular and told them I'd slept in a church doorway, it was all a bit much for them. I was just given a serious telling off. Talking of security reminds me of another story. One of the staff who'd played an important part in radar development during World War II arrived at the gate without his pass. Since he'd been through security for 20 years, he expected to be waved through. However, he was emphatically denied entry. He lost his temper, drove down to the side fence, parked his car, took out a pair of wire cutters and let himself in. He was extremely lucky not to get the sack. It was his part in the World War II defence of the country that came to his aid. Episode 9. The End of the Wonky Wing Austin 16 GCG 969. I did quite a lot of miles in the Wonky Wing Austin, but eventually the engine began to use more and more oil. For a time I countered by frequently topping it up. However, one day I forgot, and somewhere on a hill in Malvern the engine ceased solid. Some friends towed it to a scrapyard. After all, for many of its parts, the scrapyard was their home. Episode 10. The second Austin 16, GWO 496, and a ghostly noise. I needed another car. I was pretty conversant with Austin 16s, so it seemed sensible to replace it with another one. Anyway, I preferred not to have the complexity of hydraulic brakes. For a time, GWO 496 was quite reliable. Then one day, on a trip to Birmingham, I heard an ominous knocking. The further we went, the louder it got. My courage ran out, and I turned for home. To my surprise, the knocking gradually reduced, and by the time we reached Malvern it had stopped altogether. We never heard it again. Episode 11. The Sewage Works and the Pig Farm. I finished my course at RE on the 25th of October 1963, but decided that I didn't want to look for an electronics job immediately. I found a post advertised as a labourer building a new sewage works in Ledbury. During our time in Aldwyn Tower, Stuart had worked some weekends at a pig farm. A pig farm and a sewage farm were not what the college had intended. Nevertheless, I put on several pullovers under my jacket to appear more muscular and drove over to Ledbury in the GWO 496. They took me on and I did a variety of jobs. There were some amusing episodes, and I later wrote a 3-page description of my time there. However, I'm trying to stick to vehicles, so I will just relate my experiences driving their dumper truck. The driver of the dumper suddenly left it in the middle of the site, with its engine running, and walked out of the gate. It was very strange. He spoke to no one and didn't collect his money at the end of the week. The ganger, a short but very muscular Lithuanian, said to me, "You've got a licence, you drive it." I didn't enlighten him that my licence was provisional and had a go. It had 4 gears, 3 forward and 1 in reverse. They were arranged in an H, with the first and reverse opposite. It was not in good condition. The clutch was almost in or out, and the gears sounded as if they had square teeth. Recently, looking at photos on the internet, I reckon it was a Benford 1-ton dumper with a single-cylinder Petter engine. Driving around the site delivering concrete blocks was easy, but they wanted me to take concrete from the huge mixer, drive about 400 yards down the road, and dump the load into a shuttered trench. The wheels that steered were at the back. This was good for manoeuvring at slow speed, but driving down the road you had to be careful not to get into an oscillation, with the concrete slurping from side to side. You also couldn't brake too quickly, or you dumped the load on the road. When you arrived at the trench, you had to edge up to it and then operate the tipping lever. The vicious clutch didn't help, and there was a danger of ending up in the trench with the dumper on top of you. It was particularly difficult in the wet, or when there was a slight downward slope. Modern dumpers have a safety bar which gives a degree of protection. In the mornings, getting it going with the starting handle was quite difficult. That is, until they gave me an ether spray, a technique I noted for future use. I got on well with the other guys there. There were about 8 of us labourers. However, they could be cruel. There was a boy who was a bit simple. Most of the time he was treated well, but other times they played tricks on him. One guy sent him off to the shop about a mile away to get some cornflakes. When the boy returned, the trickster said, "What's this? I sent you off for goldflake." It was a type of tobacco. They all, including the boy, roared with laughter. He thought that it was his fault, so I had to go back to make the exchange. A couple of lunchtimes they went ratting. Their version consisted of driving the dumper backwards and forwards across the nearby rubbish dump. The rats would run out, and the sportsmen would try to shoot them with the Hilti nail gun that we used to fix doorways in place. It used small cartridges, similar to .22 blanks. This device, for safety reasons, didn't have a trigger. You had to hit the end of it with a hammer to fire the charge. I never saw them actually hit a rat, but there was lots of running about and shouting. The 2 bosses and the ganger went to the pub at lunchtimes. This left room for a little private enterprise. The guys would arrange things so there was some so-called leftover tarmac. They would then go off and do neighbours' paths. I was co-opted to bring the tarmac in the dumper. There was a very strict class structure. At the top were the 2 bosses. They communicated with us via the ganger. He was below them, but they did go to the pub together. Below the ganger, although they probably didn't see it that way, were the 2 skilled trades. The painters, who drove in very early each day from Birmingham, and the JCB driver. They kept to themselves and ate in their vans. Below them were us, the riff-raff. Separate to this was the carpenter. He was a Jamaican called Rupert. There was no racial prejudice, and he got on well with everyone. I tried to talk to the JCB driver. I would have loved to have a go, but he would have none of it. The guy said that JCB drivers jealously guarded their skills. I made friends with Rupert and became assigned as a carpenter's mate. Apart from making door frames and shuttering, we built a little brick pumping station. We were very proud of it. In later years I took Rosalind to see it, but sadly it had been knocked down. At Christmas 1963, the bosses took us to the pub, and several of us were laid off. Episode 12, The Tramp. During my time at Ledbury, Rosalind and I used the Austin to go to a folk club run by some friends of ours in Worcester. One evening, arriving back at the Austin in the car park, we discovered a tramp sleeping on the back seat. We explained that we were going to Malvern. Not wishing to accompany us, he got out. On the way back, one of the headlights came loose and began to illuminate the trees. Oncoming traffic started to flash us. Not wanting to fix it in the dark, I discovered that if I turned it on and off, Honor was satisfied and the flashing stopped. Episode 13. Lack of a full license. Although I'd passed my test for a motorcycle, I started driving the Austin 16 on a provisional. One time, coming back from a long journey alone, it was dark and I was tired. I pulled into a lay-by and got into the back for a snooze. I was woken by a couple of police who wanted to know what I was doing. They asked to see my driving licence. I said that I didn't have it with me, but showed them my RRE security pass. Luckily that satisfied them. Perhaps they didn't want the paperwork of making me present my licence at a police station. My mother kept bothering me about getting a test for a full licence. Eventually she booked one for me in Truro. We put on the L plates and Rosalind and I drove down there. At one point in the test the examiner took me down a fairly narrow road and asked me to do a 3-point turn. I explained that the Austin's poor turning circle made it impossible. "Well, do what you'd have to do," he said. Resisting the urge to say that I would back out, I did what was about a 6-point turn. Next we came to the steep Infirmary Hill. I could have changed down at the bottom before attempting it, but showing off, planned to do a double D-clutch part way up. This was something I could normally do with ease, but with the examiner watching me I messed it up. I blamed it on the faulty synchromesh. He didn't know the Austin 16 and I got my licence. Episode 14. I get a job at Smith's Aircraft Instruments, Bishop's Cleeve. In January 1964 I needed a proper job. There was a post advertised to set up an electronics section at the Motor Industry Research Association, MIRA, Nuneaton. I applied and was offered the job. Rosalind and I drove to Nuneaton to have a look, but we didn't like Nuneaton, so I turned down what would have been a very good job. Instead I wrote to Smith's Aircraft Instruments in Bishop's Cleeve and offered them my services. They called me up for an interview and I talked myself into a job in the Navigational Instruments section as the only electronics engineer among a whole lot of mechanical engineers. It was a bit daunting, but I discovered a flaw in the Tactical Air Navigation System, TACAN, of what was then our supersonic frontline fighter, the English Electric Lightning. It had to be put right, and it established my status. There were 3 of us travelling the 20-odd miles from Malvern. We didn't get on that well, but to economise shared transport, my contribution was the GWO 496 Austin 16. Episode 15. Hell's Mouth. Now that I was established at Smith's, I proposed to Rosalind at Hell's Mouth in Cornwall. Luckily she accepted and I didn't have to jump off. We got married a few months later in Malvern. Episode 16. The Damp Flat. Advice from friends we shouldn't have listened to said that we should have an unfurnished flat. We didn't make a good choice. Although it looked quite good, it was damp and had an outside toilet. There's more about it in my video Topolino Road Trip 1966 England to Istanbul. Episode 17. Flash and the World Bank. One night we were woken up by a knock on the door. It was Flash and his friend Alf Ganderton. They'd got a car stuck sideways on against a tree 3/4 of the way up the Malvern Hills. This was nowhere near a road, but I didn't ask them how it came about. The three of us managed to free it. No, we didn't cut the tree down. With the introduction of the internet, curiosity led me to look him up. Over the years he was working in Malawi, Morocco, Afghanistan, Nepal, etc. And in 2015 I found a photo of him, CEO of a company in India and a consultant to the World Bank. This photo shows the World Bank head office in Washington, D.C. Episode 18. How to escape the desert by turning a 2CV car into a motorbike. This episode does not concern a vehicle belonging to one of my friends. However, if true, it must be the most amazing car fix of all time. There's no doubt that it was done. The question is, was it planned in advance? Personally, I believe it. This is the story as told by Emile Leray, the magician who carried out the transformation. Travelling in his 2CV east of Tantan in southern Morocco, the car hit a rock and seriously damaged one of the front-wheel drive assemblies. Carrying only limited tools, repair looked impossible. Then he came up with an outrageous idea. Convert the remains of the four-wheel car into a two-wheeled motorbike. He had 8 days of water and decided to stake all on the plan. He had a camera with a remote and was able to take a few photos of the operation. This photo shows the 2CV in pieces, and this photo shows the assembled motorbike. He managed to ride the thing and reached Tantan. Was he given a medal for his ingenuity? Like heck he was, and although he had mounted the original number plate, he was fined 4,500 dirhams for not having the correct paperwork for his creation. Eventually he had the device transported to his home in France. This is where this photo was taken. There's a lot about it on the internet, and a suggestion is made that he planned it in advance. If so, he went to an awful lot of trouble to carry it out. The story is much more complicated than this summary. Have a look at the website and videos and make up your own mind. Episode 19. The Austin began to develop faults. A guy we knew had a 1934 Lanchester LA10 VY6213, and we decided to do a swap. The Lanchester was fun to drive, and we felt we looked a bit like Bonnie and Clyde. The controls were unusual. Gears were selected in advance by a little hand-operated lever that moved over a scale. When ready to change, one pushed the leftmost pedal. The epicyclic gearbox and the fluid flywheel completed the action. In principle, this should give a smooth transfer, a bit like an automatic. However, the car had its problems, and the change was fairly rough. Another eccentricity was that it had a hand-operated throttle. It had a good battery, but when the cold weather arrived it began to be very difficult to start. It was then that I remembered the dumper and the ether. I went into town and visited Baylis's, a local chemist. We didn't call them a pharmacy in those days. The girl behind the counter was not used to requests such as mine, and fetched the proprietor. He wanted to know what I wanted the ether for. He was a bit bemused by the answer, but persuaded I didn't want it for illegal purposes, agreed to sell me some. He fetched a Winchester and a funnel, and decanted half a pint into a glass bottle. The charge was not excessive. My mother was a great believer in Sinex nasal spray as a treatment for winter colds. When I left home she had provided me with supply. It came in a small white squeezy bottle, about 2.5 inches in diameter and about 1 inch thick. It had a green hexagonal screw top. Being a bit of a kleptomaniac, I still had it, and it looked just the job for squirting the ether. I tested to see the ether didn't dissolve it, and then Rosalind and I set out for a trial. To gain access to the carburetor inlet, it was necessary to disconnect the flexible crankcase breather tube. We set the choke, and Rosalind sat in the driver's seat. She pressed the starter and jiggled the hand throttle while I squirted the ether. Success! The engine sprung into life. However, we were not prepared for a surprise. Clouds of oily smoke issued from the breather tube. The boards were very worn, and the piston rings could not prevent hot gases passing them. I quickly reconnected the tube, and the fumes were consumed in the engine. The Lanchester had other endearing properties. No screen heater to clear ice, no water pump, so sometimes in traffic it overheated and came to a halt. Although I finally sold it for £0.50, it's still listed on the government road tax site. So if the present owner contacts me, I can supply him with some of its original documents. For example, a toolkit list, a letter to the first owner, the maintenance manual. I also have a few items, such as the original left and right wheel nuts. They were not the same. If you want to know more about it and its successor, our Fiat Topolino, have a look at my video Topolino to Istanbul. It also describes the fixes that eventually got the Topolino to its destination. This is the end of part 2. Part 3 will follow when finished.